Here's a rundown of the key points from Quiz 1. So, Hatshepsut did a number of things to try to make it possible for her to be accepted as pharaoh. And in particular, this is about imagery and representation. This is about putting herself in the public space as a legitimate king, but still as herself. And so, as many of you pointed out, everybody knows Hatshepsut is a woman, and her starting point is that she has better blood than her husband. Her husband is only half royal. She is fully royal. She's descended on both sides, mother and father, from Ahmose the Great, and so Hatshepsut has a superior starting point that allows her to place her imagery in the public space in a way that reinforces her claim to the throne. And so she is depicted in traditional royal accoutrements, the beard and the flay and scepter and so forth, all these things that are associated with pharaohs and that are representative of the traditional imagery of pharaohs that has been part of the pharaohship. The pharaohs themselves are very seldom seen because they are manifestations of the gods. They don't go out and live and operate amongst men and women. They therefore are in a position of being at this reserve and being apart from the human condition. And so the main way in which people interact with the pharaohs is through visual imagery, through frescoes, through statues, through inscriptions, and through word of mouth, through the presence of stories in the culture. And Hatshepsut uses these very effectively. Physical images of her, sculptures and paintings, and stories about her divinely inspired birth and so forth and so on. All these to place herself in a prominent position within the community so that she is able to demonstrate her ability to be a good king, which is the other factor that comes into play. What happened to Hatshepsut's legacy? Okay, so we talked about this a great deal in the class discussion. What happened is that some considerable amount of time, 15, 20 years after she dies, her previous co-ruler, now ruling alone, her nephew and son-in-law, Thutmose III. Thutmose III decides to remove Hatshepsut from the period, from the human record. So he takes all of her sculptures and throws them into a pit and tears down some of her temples and walls up her inscriptions and so forth. Again, tremendous irony, because the fact that these were buried and walled up meant that they were preserved very effectively, so that we have better records of Hatshepsut now than we do for people like Thutmose III. But, so this is called damnatio memoriae. The elimination of the living memory of an individual. And the explanations for this have been many over the years, and a lot of people have assumed in the past that this had a great deal to do with Thutmose III's resentment of his aunt Hatshepsut and her taking the glory and so forth. But the question is asking, what does the reading argue? And the reading, mentions these theories, but takes note of the fact that there's a long delay, and that the damnatio happens toward the end of Thutmose III's reign, which suggests that it has to do with questions about his succession. And, maybe there's pressure going on to prevent a recurrence of female inheritance. They're concerned about this having established a precedent. This might have to do with the general idea that it would be potentially angering to the gods, or potentially non-traditional to create this change to allow for this precedent to hold. One thing that's important to note is that endemic to Egyptian culture is this idea of permanence and cycle. Everything about Egyptian culture, it has its roots in the Nile, and the Nile is unchanging. It always provides this flood every year that ensures the immense fertility of Egyptian soil, and so the Egyptian culture is predicated on the idea that things do not change, that there is a permanence, that whenever there is an alteration, things will cycle back around to the way that they were, and that the gods will always take care to ensure that the prosperity of Egypt is permanent and unchanging. And so the Egyptians are very uncomfortable and frightened of things that provide major transformative change. And the advent of Hatshepsut herself is an effective ruler, but to create the precedent of female inheritance rather than it being a one-time thing, this is something that the Egyptians would have had a great deal of trouble with because of their endemic culture, not because of misogyny, but because it represents a traumatic change to tradition that goes back, 2,000 years almost at this point. So this is one possible reason that they're concerned about the precedent of female inheritance. There's also the possibility that there is a particular woman of the next generation that they want to head off that woman succeeding. They want to steer the succession. Whoever takes over after Thutmose III, they want to steer the succession to somebody else. So these are the possibilities. The general idea here is that you don't want to assume misogyny. You don't want to assume oppression of women. You want to look at the evidence and see what the evidence is telling you. And most of all, you want to talk about the treatment of women and the expectations of gender within the context of the particular culture and period that you're talking about. This is vitally important. Leave your assumptions behind. Leave you come to ancient history and you think all women in ancient history are being repressed. Leave that behind. Because what you're doing is, women in ancient history are not treated like we expect modern women to be treated. You're in the ancient world, and what you want to look for is different kinds of balance between gender, different kinds of, expectations toward women in one way and expectations toward men in another. And as we talked about in terms of Egypt is these expectations and balance are much closer than anywhere else, because in Egypt, all the power is concentrated in the pharaoh, especially in the Old Kingdom. It's more complicated in the New Kingdom, where there are business magnates and the power of the priests has separated itself. But in terms of the way that the culture thinks about power, it's vested in the pharaoh and the gods, and ordinary citizens do not have a voice in the community. Everywhere else in the ancient world, men assume that they can gather an assembly and make decisions on behalf of the city. Doesn't happen in Egypt. And so the result is men and women have very similar voice. And as a result, they both sort of live in the private world, and they both sort of act as peers in the Egyptian community, relatively speaking, to the rest of the ancient world. Multiple choice. All the following are true of Hatshepsut and Thutmose III, except they did sponsor an expedition to Punt, which was widely publicized, and we have this huge inscription and frescoes about the expedition to Punt, which makes a great deal of the fact that they did this thing. This Punt is of special importance because it's on the far fringes of Egyptian awareness of the world to the south and east. It's essentially the gateway to the Indian Ocean, which is very, very alien to the Egyptians. The Egyptians are connected to the Mediterranean. They have exploitation to the south down the Nile, but anything that's away from the Nile is alien and bizarre to them, and in particular, anything beyond Punt is beyond their ken. So, Expedition Punt, very big deal, hyped up and over dramatized. They ruled jointly for about 15 years, that's right. On some monuments, they're depicted as twin male rulers, that's right. Hatshepsut always in the first and primary position. And in some places, Thutmose III is shown smaller. But the point is that Hatshepsut and Thutmose are represented as co-rulers, even though Hatshepsut comes first. So the thing that's not true is that they were half siblings. It's Hatshepsut and Thutmose II who were half siblings. Thutmose III, who is his son, is therefore, nephew and other things to Hatshepsut. What do you think of the main reasons Hatshepsut was accepted as a female king and able to rule for so long? So a lot of you brought up a lot of different positive answers to this. The first and primary thing is, as I mentioned, she had a better claim to the throne because she was of royal blood on both sides. Not true of Thutmose II, who is only half royal. Not true of Thutmose III, who is the son of Thutmose II and concubine, so even less royal. So Hatshepsut, fully royal. This is extremely important to the Egyptians. This is why they married their sisters, so that the bloodlines would not be diluted. And this is her starting point. She's able to show her capacity as princess and as God's wife of Amun. And then as queen with Thutmose II, she's in a prominent place and very visible long before she's even regent and acting on behalf of the underage Thutmose III. By the time Thutmose III comes of age, she has been in a position of power and authority for a very long time and shown her competence, her acumen, her ability to lead, very probably in contrast to Thutmose II and Thutmose III. And so she was able to claim the pharaohship in demonstration of her ability and the fact that this was clearly something that the gods had been allowing to foster and continue. There's a tacit idea here that, she was able to claim the pharaohship, because her ability showed. She was able to act on this ability. She was able to demonstrate the favor of the gods through the fact that she had been a successful princess, a successful god's wife of Amun, a successful queen, a successful regent. So by the time she becomes pharaoh, she's already shown the position. So these are the two major things, in addition to the imagery, the propaganda, the shortcomings of Thutmose II and Thutmose III. Most of all, she is in a position to be a strong pharaoh, and she has the claim to put her in that position.
And that's the end of the quiz. Email me with any questions.